Alright, hello, my name is Morgan Anheir, and today I'm going to be discussing my research study about misinformation about hot yoga on TikTok and Instagram. So first of all, in a study by Rory Mulcahy and his team in Australia, they identified that videos with a high amount of views or likes, people tend to agree with more versus videos that have a low amount of views or likes. This is a problem because if there are posts that are presented in a convincing manner and they have a high like count or went viral, people tend to believe them even when they shouldn't and they are misinformed. So I wanted to make sure that if something is discussing misinformation or they're discussing healthcare, that it is being told in truthful ways and those that are believing it are believing facts. So I wanted to define some keywords before I begin. First of all, hot yoga. In a research study by Zoe Hewitt, she defined hot yoga as an exercise that lasts for 90 minutes in 40% humidity with temperatures of 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's a type of hatha yoga. And that's how she defined it in her experimental research study reviewing hot yoga, talking about the effects it has on mental health. So that is how I'm going to be referring to hot yoga. So whenever I say that, that's the type of exercise I'm referring to. My second key term is misinformation. Misinformation was defined by UNESCO as false information without bad intent. So in other words, false information told by someone who believed it to be true as well. And then social media, whenever I refer to social media, I'm referring to a digital environment where people can interact with content and also post content. So misinformation is apparent in our online world, and this is a problem because people believe everything they see online, and that has been confirmed by my previous research study that I cited. And the Pew Research Center and Richard Weick had realized that by surveying citizens of 19 different countries, that there was a consensus that they believe that social media has increased manipulation and online and politics and health. And so this is a problem that needs to be researched. So the current system monitoring misinformation on TikTok and Instagram is on both platforms you can report it. On Instagram, it will go to a third party to be separately reviewed if it is misinformation, and what can happen afterwards is the video can be taken down, shown with a warning, or stay up. On TikTok, it's slightly less than that. You can also report things for misinformation, but it will be reviewed by an internal healthcare team, or not healthcare, an internal TikTok team. And that shows another problem because if it's an internal team, there's automatic bias and shows that those videos are likely to stay up. So this is a problem as it's not a very secure system, especially on TikTok. And so if there is misinformation, it's slightly staying up on both platforms. And so I wanted to see if there is a detectable amount of misinformation that might show that these platforms need to increase their monitoring styles. So in a research study by Thomas Swain and Gerald McGuinn, they analyzed hospital records from 2001 to 2014, and they saw an increase in hospital admissions for yoga-related injuries. This isn't a problem because if these injuries are caused by people performing the exercise misinformed, then that shows that there is a problem online that needs to be fixed. And so I wanted to identify if these hot yoga related injuries are caused because they're being misinformed by the content and the discussion online. And so to establish my gap, I understood that there are research studies about misinformation in general. In a study by Sierra Kirkpatrick and Larissa Lurie, they identified that women have been identified to commonly use TikTok for health information, but this is just a general research study, and there are similar research studies like this, but they just generally viewed this, and they did not clearly show that anything with a specific trend like hot yoga. And hot yoga has also been reviewed academically, but in most of those studies, those are just experimental studies looking at the effects of hot yoga physically and mentally, and they aren't looking at the misinformation rates. And so my study is going to connect those two and look specifically at misinformation rates about hot yoga. So that brings me to my research question: to what extent is there misinformation surrounding hot yoga on TikTok and Instagram? So what I hypothesized, and I based my hypothesis on Lida Safranovjed's research study, where she looked at the discussion on Twitter about the Zika virus, and she started off with a sample size of 5,000 posts because she had a big research team, and she identified 400 had a significant amount of misinformation. That was 8% of her sample size, and so I expect to find a similar result where I start off with a large sample and just a minor, less than 10% has misinformation. So I decided on doing a content analysis on TikTok and Instagram. And so let's look at what that looked like. So my data collection started by starting with 50 posts. 23 of those were on Instagram and 27 were TikTok videos. They had to have a minimum of 10,000 or a max or minimum of 10,000 views because we wanted to establish that those videos are popular and were relevant to my data. And then I decided on a qualitative and quantitative research study because I needed to look at the qualitative claims made in all the posts, and I wanted to look at the quantitative interaction statistics to establish that these videos are popular and are likely being believed, as I established in my first point. And then I decided on an inductive content analysis. This means that I did not preset categories, which would be a deductive content analysis, and this allowed me to look at what thematic claims presented themselves and emerged after I collected my data, not before. So my first charting system was I made video identification, so I put the username, I gave it a 1 through 50 number, so I could make sure I could go back to those videos, and I put a link in my charts. Then what I did was I logged the interaction statistics. That means I logged the amount of views, likes, comments, shares, reposts, favorites. And this allowed me to establish that these videos were popular and were being viewed by real users. And then I summarized the claims in my last column of my chart so that I could go back to it and review the claims being made, because most times they had more than one claim. So then I set thematic categories so that I could look at the patterns that emerged. And so I'll give an example for all of these categories. Mental health talked about depression and anxiety mainly. Physical performance talked about a strength increase or decrease. Physiological health was internal health. Most claims about those were about metabolism. Body composition were claims about tone or loss of weight, so the aesthetic look of a body. Comparative claims were talking about it was better than the gym or better than hot Pilates. And then dermatological claims were about skin health, and so it cleared up skin problems and blemishes. So what I did was I did binary coding. That means that if something was in that thematic category, it received a 0, and if it was in that thematic category, it received a 1, and if there was a claim that was not made in that thematic category, it received a 0. So this is what that can look like. So video 1 had a claim in mental health, but it did not have a claim in the physiological or physio health. So that's why I logged it in this way, and I did that for all 50 of my posts and all 6 of my categories. So then I moved on to the main point of my coding, which was misinformation coding. So if it was completely true and was backed by my 22 credible sources, it received a 0, meaning it was truthful and contained no misinformation. If it received a 1, it had a slight amount of exaggeration, but it was backed. So a claim that would be an example of this was there was a post that said depression decreased by 50%, and I could not find that figure protected by any of my credible sources, so I logged it as a 1. And then if it was completely false and completely not backed by any established medical opinion, it received a 2 so that I could mark it as fully misinformed. And so what that looked like in my charting system was this. So again, with my binary code, I identified that it had a 1 for misinformation, or 1 in this category. If it had, and then I logged it for misinformation as a 1, which means it had an exaggeration, and I cited my source. Now what it would look like if I identified that it did not have misinformation, it would receive a 0 and I would cite my source. And so that's what my charts looked like for all 50, and then each individual category had a misinformation, explanation, and source. And then these were my results. For my quantitative statistics, this is a histogram showing the average amount of views. And so as you can see, most videos had 10,000 to 4,000 views, and a few had up to 1 million views. And so this established that all these videos were popular, and I identified an average amount of views of 1,801 average views. And so this means that all these videos were very popular and were being showed to real people, then likely they believed all this content. And then my new understanding is that I calculated an average rate of 34.5% misinformation per each average post. And this is this one exceeded my original hypothesis of receiving a lesser than 10% amount of misinformation. It is not extremely concerning because it is not over 50%, but it is moderately significant because that means 1 in 3 of videos were misinformed. Now, to ensure that my calculations were reliable, I added another peer coder to my team. What I did was I presented to her my blank coding charts, all the credible sources I used, and then all of the original charting system that detailed the interaction statistics and the summarized qualitative claims. And she identified an average rate of 35.6% of misinformation, and then that is just a 1.1% difference than what I calculated. And so this ensures that my results were reliable. It is not identical with the result I got, so it just agrees, but it still backs up the reliability of my results. Now, my limitations that I faced were slightly limiting because I did have a low sample size. As I mentioned earlier with Lita Safner-Jed, her sample was of 5,000 and I had 50. So if I had more time and resources, I would definitely love to have added more, but again, it was just a limited amount of resources. There also is researcher bias. In most sources that I use as foundational sources, they had 5 to 6 researchers on their team, but I only had one of me and then one other coder. So this shows that there was a possible concern of researcher bias. And then these posts were reviewed on algorithmic platforms. That means that there was an intelligent algorithm that was looking at the videos I was interested in. It might not have showed me what the average viewers saw. To minimize this limitation, I created 2 new accounts on Instagram and TikTok and did not use a personal account, but still there is always a risk of algorithmic bias that could not have been avoided because of the nature of these platforms. And then the implications are that this could decrease trust in misinformation, which would be positive for users online because then they will do their own fact check and hopefully minimize yoga-related injuries because they are going to decrease their trust in things they see online. And then this could increase moderation because, as I mentioned earlier, there is a concern of lesser moderation on TikTok and Instagram, and these results might pressure TikTok and Instagram and other social media platforms to increase their levels of moderation. And so what I would recommend for future research is to look at this on other platforms. Those could include Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and look at this and see if any results are different or more, and that could determine if one of these platforms is more trustworthy or lesser. Then to look at more posts and increase the sample size, and then have more coders and look into other trends. I was also interested in looking at cold plunges, compression therapy, sauna health misinformation. So I would have loved to do this same research format just with those trends, and I suggest that to future researchers. And then these are my sources.
How did you determine which results generated by your research method were most important in informing your new understanding?
I made sure I looked at videos in my data collection. I made sure that I looked at videos that were talking about hot yoga in an informative way and not just talking about hot yoga as a vlog format. So that ensured that the videos I started with were relevant to my research, and then looking at the rates of misinformation in my very thorough analyzation, I ensured that those videos were relevant and calculated an accurate result of misinformation.
And how do your findings provide directions for future research in the field?
So my findings recommend to look into adding more coders, adding more sample sizes, and looking into other trends. And so my findings recommend to look into all of those because there was a significant amount of research detected, or some significant amount of misinformation detected, my 34.5% number. And so by increasing those numbers, like those results presented that this research needs to be redone in other formats. And so that's what I would recommend to future researchers.
How did you handle the uncertainty of the research process?
I depended on my foundational sources, like Lita Safnerjed's similar research study. I looked into her method of looking, and I very similarly followed the steps that she had taken in her method to go and figure out how to develop my method. And so that helped me go through the uncertainty of the research process and ensure that my results are similar to pre-done research studies.